The arena sat half-lit and closed with humidity the night it happened. Los Angeles, September 1964, and the Long Beach Memorial Sports Arena held just over 2,000 people, most of them seated on folding chairs arranged in tight rows around a demonstration floor that smelled of canvas and chalk and the particular anxiety that gathers in rooms where men have agreed to test one another. The overhead fluorescence threw everything in a blue-white wash. The bleachers were full. People had driven from as far as San Diego and Fresno for this. Some had driven from San Francisco. This was the Ed Parker International Karate Championships, the largest open competition of its kind held on American soil to that point. And the energy inside the building carried the self-conscious intensity of a movement that believed it was writing history. The crowd was overwhelmingly male, mostly young, mostly holding their programs and scanning the floor with the proprietary attention of people who had trained long enough to know what they were watching. The champion arrived with an entourage. His name was not famous outside of tournament circuits at that time, but inside those circuits it meant something specific and earned. He was 23 years old, 6 feet and 2 inches tall. He weighed 192 pounds and not an ounce of it was casual. He had trained in Japan for 3 years before returning to the United States. And he carried himself with the deliberate stillness of a man who had been corrected so many times he had finally run out of things to correct. His competition record stood at 47 wins and 4 losses. And those 4 losses had all come in his first 8 months of competition, before his technique had settled into the form it now held. He held 3 separate regional titles. He had, 6 months prior, knocked a man unconscious in the finals of a regional tournament in Phoenix with a reverse punch that 4 witnesses later described independently as the fastest single strike any of them had ever seen at close range. He was not arrogant, he was certain, which is a different thing and more difficult to argue with. He was exactly the kind of man who does not need to make noise about what he can do, because what he can do speaks before he enters the room. He had not been told who was sitting in the 4th row on the west side of the floor, 3rd seat in from the center aisle. He would not have recognized the name if someone had told him. Very few people in that building recognized it. In 1964, the man in the 4th row was not yet a name that crossed from one country to another. He was 23 years old. He was small. He wore a plain cotton jacket the color of old newspaper over a dark shirt, and he had taken a program from the usher without making eye contact, and he had sat down with the unhurried economy of motion of a man who has never needed to announce his arrival anywhere. His feet were flat on the floor, his hands were in his lap. He was watching the floor with a quality of attention that was different from curiosity. It was the attention of a man who already knows most of what he is looking at and is checking a few remaining details. No one in the 4th row, 3rd seat from the aisle, paid him particular notice. In 11 minutes, in front of 2,014 people. Something would happen that 11 of those people would still be describing with complete accuracy 30 years later. A tournament official who had seen every major demonstration held in the United States between 1959 and 1980 would say, in a 1993 interview, that it was the single most efficient resolution of a public challenge he had ever witnessed. Not the most dramatic. He specifically corrected himself when the word dramatic came up. He said efficient. He said it twice. Nobody in that building knew they were about to witness a kind of efficiency that does not have a name in any martial art. If you want to find out what happened in those 11 minutes, stay until the end of this video. And if you are new here, make sure you subscribe now, because what we are about to show you is the kind of story that disappears between the cracks of official history, and we are going to tell it the only way it deserves to be told. The champion's name moved through the room the way names move through rooms like that one. It arrived in small clusters. Someone would lean to someone else, and the lean would carry the name, and the name would carry the record, and the record would carry a particular quality of anticipatory silence that spreads through a crowd of trained people differently than it spreads through any other kind of crowd. Trained people do not applaud what they have not yet seen. They wait. They assess. Their applause, when it comes, means something technical in addition to something emotional, and the champion understood this and had arranged his arrival accordingly. He took the floor with 4 members of his school for a demonstration that had been scheduled as a warm-up to the evening's main competition brackets. The demonstration was exceptional. This is not a detail inserted to balance what comes later. It was genuinely, technically exceptional. The 4 students moved in coordinated patterns that required years to produce, and the champion moved among them with the quality that separates instruction from demonstration. He was not performing what he could do. He was clarifying it. The difference is visible to anyone who is trained seriously, and there were at least 400 people in that arena who had trained seriously, and every one of them recognized it. When his reverse punch landed against a held board and split it at the diagonal, the sound it made was a specific sound, dry and absolute, the sound of something that has been decided. And the crowd responded not with applause but with a brief collective exhale, which is the higher compliment. He knew it was the higher compliment. He had heard it before. The demonstration ended. The applause came. It was real applause, not polite applause, and he accepted it with a slight bow and held it, and then he walked to the microphone that had been placed at the south end of the floor for introductions and announcements, and he did something that was not scheduled. He took the microphone. The tournament official seated at the scorer's table in the northeast corner looked up from his clipboard. He looked at the champion holding the microphone, and he set his pen down. Later, he would not be able to explain precisely why he set the pen down at that specific moment. He said only that something in the way the champion's hand closed around the microphone told him the clipboard could wait. What the champion said into that microphone carried into the upper rows and into the rafters and into the particular quality of silence that had followed the applause. He said that he had trained in Japan under masters whose lineage went back before any school currently represented in this building. He said he had seen many demonstrations tonight that were well-intentioned. He paused on the word well-intentioned the way a man pauses on a word he has selected very carefully. He said there was one thing that all the demonstrations shared, which was that they had been performed in ideal conditions against cooperative partners, and that ideal conditions were a courtesy that conflict did not extend, and that he wanted to clarify the difference for the audience. Because the audience deserved clarity. He said that if anyone in the building believed their system translated from demonstration to contact, he was willing to provide a few seconds of honest education. He held the microphone a moment longer than he needed to. He looked at the crowd with the expression of a man who has issued a challenge he does not expect to be answered. Because in his experience, challenges issued publicly at this level are not answered. They are absorbed. They are absorbed because the room understands the math. The person who steps forward either wins something small or loses something enormous, and the math does not favor stepping forward. He was using the math as armor. He had used it this way before. It had held before. He set the microphone back on its stand with the precise care of a man who considers the conversation closed. In the 4th row, on the west side, 3rd seat from the center aisle, the man in the old newspaper-colored jacket did not move immediately. He sat with his hands still in his lap for a moment that several witnesses later described as somewhere between 4 and 8 seconds. One witness, a judo instructor from Torrance who had competed in 3 national tournaments, said it was the calmest 8 seconds she had ever seen a human being spend. She said his face did not change, not in the direction of anger, not in the direction of decision. It was already decided. He was simply allowing a certain amount of time to pass before he stood. Because some information needs a moment to settle before it is useful. He stood up. He removed his jacket with one motion. He did not shake it out. He folded it once, lengthwise, and laid it across the back of the empty chair to his left. He set his program on top of it. He stepped past the 2 people between himself and the aisle without any particular hurry, and one of those people, a man in his 40s who competed in the over 40 lightweight division, later said that the only way he could describe what he experienced as the small man passed him was that it felt like standing near something that had already happened and was only now arriving. He walked onto the floor. He walked toward the microphone stand and past it, stopping approximately 11 feet from the champion. And he stood there with his hands at his sides, relaxed, and he did not say anything yet, and the room made no sound. The champion looked at him for a moment with the frank assessment of a man recalculating. What he saw was 5 feet 7 1/2 inches, 136 pounds, dark shirt, no shoes, no bow, no announcement of school or lineage or record. The man was simply standing there on the canvas in the blue-white fluorescent light as though he had been standing there for years and had simply become visible. The champion said, quietly enough that only the front rows heard it clearly, "You should know that I have 47 wins." The man in the dark shirt said, "Show me." A fight is not two men attempting to harm each other. This is the fundamental misunderstanding that beginners carry and experts spend years removing. A fight is a conversation about space, conducted at a speed that punishes misunderstanding. It is a negotiation about distance, and the entire negotiation can turn on a single, misjudged inch. Every trained fighter in that arena understood this at the level of reflex. They understood that the question the champion needed to answer first was not how hard to hit, or where to hit, or when to hit. The question was where to stand. Because where you stand determines everything that follows, and where you stand is not geography, it is intention made physical. The champion chose to close the distance. This was his first assessment. The man across from him was smaller, which meant shorter reach, which meant the preferred distance was closer rather than farther, and closing was the champion's strength. He had 4 regional titles built partly on his ability to close on opponents who thought the gap between them was time they could use. He began to move forward with a lateral angle, the standard shifting approach. And he threw the first technique at second one. It was a left jab, high line, technically precise, thrown with the correct hip rotation and the correct guard position maintained and the correct weight transfer. At full extension it found nothing. The man in the dark shirt had moved at the moment of commitment, not before. Not in anticipation. At the moment, which is a different thing, and a much more expensive thing to train against, because anticipation can be faked and commitment cannot. He moved 3 inches to the outside and the jab passed through where his head had been, and he was already somewhere else, and his hands had not moved from his sides. The champion felt the shift before he understood it. His second attempt came faster. A right straight followed immediately by a grab attempt at the collar, a combination he had used successfully 11 times in competition because it placed pressure on both the defender's block and his grip, and most people cannot manage both at once. Most people. The right straight arrived at the space the man's face occupied and found it empty by an amount that was not dramatic. It was not a large movement. It was exactly the required movement and no more, and the economy of it was the thing the judo instructor from Torrance would describe first whenever she told this story, not the speed, not the footwork. But the refusal to spend more than was necessary. The grab attempt found a wrist. For a fraction of a second the champion had him, and then the wrist rotated, simply and without force, in a direction that was anatomically available but structurally unexpected, and the grab resolved into empty air, and the champion's forward momentum had carried him through the space where the smaller man had been. And when he turned, the man was already facing him from a new angle, and his hands were still at his sides. The tournament official at the scorer's table had both palms flat on the table. He was not writing. His pen was where he had set it. A student from the champion's own school, seated in the front row, described it later as watching someone attempt to catch smoke with careful hands. 11 seconds had passed since first contact. The champion threw the third technique with everything he had, because by then he understood that measured technique was not the variable that was going to change the outcome, and there is a kind of clarity that comes from exhausting careful options, and he committed to a right round kick aimed at the midsection. Thrown with the full rotation and the full extension that had broken boards and ribs in training. It was the best thing he knew how to do. It arrived. It arrived at a guard that appeared from below the kick's trajectory, a forearm placed against the shin with a contact angle that redirected rather than stopped, and the redirection was controlled by the smaller man's left hand while his right hand was already traveling, and the right hand stopped 1.5 inches from the champion's left ear. It stopped there and held. The arena was completely silent. The distance between the knuckles and the ear was measurable. It was approximately 1.5 inches. Not 2. Not 1. 1.5, and the stopped hand held its position for a moment that several witnesses estimated at between 2 and 4 seconds, and in that moment the champion understood something very specific. And the understanding was visible on his face, which was now 11 inches from the face of the man who had been sitting in the 4th row reading a program 20 seconds ago. The man lowered his hand. He did not step back. He held his position and looked at the champion with an expression that contained no triumph and no contempt and nothing that needed to be described or reported. He extended his right hand, open, palm facing upward. He said something. He said it quietly enough that only the champion heard it, and the champion stood in the blue-white light and looked at the offered hand for a moment that felt longer than it was, and then he looked at the crowd, and then he looked back at the hand. He took it. He shook it once, in the specific way of a man who has been told something true and is acknowledging it, and then he bowed, correctly and without qualification, and the bow was lower than the bow he had given after his demonstration. It was the lower bow of a man who now knows something he did not know 11 seconds ago, and the knowing has shifted something in him that will not shift back. He stepped off the floor. He did not retrieve the microphone. The man in the dark shirt turned and walked back to the fourth row, third seat from the aisle, and he picked up his jacket from the chair and his program from on top of it, and he put the jacket back on, and he sat down, and he opened the program to the page he had been reading, and he read. The arena made a sound then. Not applause and not an exhale. Something between the two, the sound of a room that has been shown something it will spend a long time processing. The judo instructor from Torrance did not clap. She was watching the man in the dark shirt reading his program. She reached over and touched the shoulder of the woman seated next to her, and she said 2 words, and the woman looked at the fourth row, and then at the judo instructor, and then back at the fourth row. Later, the judo instructor would say the 2 words she spoke were simply his name. At that point, she was one of perhaps 40 people in the building who knew it. By the end of that evening, there were 200. By the end of that week, the number had moved through every school and dojo in Southern California, and by the end of that month, it had moved further, and the story moved with it. As stories like this one do, passing from one person to the next and collecting detail and losing detail and sometimes gaining details that had not been there originally. Which is how oral history works, which is why getting the central fact exactly right matters, and the central fact is this. The man in the dark shirt in the fourth row had done something in 11 seconds that required 47 fights to approach and could not be argued with. The champion's name moved through those years in the way that names move when they are attached to honest effort. He continued to compete. He continued to win more than he lost. He became an instructor of significant reputation in his region, and his students, when they became instructors themselves, told this story in the particular way that formative stories are told, not as cautionary tales but as calibration tools. He used it that way himself. He told it to the students he trusted with it as a story about the difference between knowing what you can do and understanding what that knowledge means. He said the man in the dark shirt had not beaten him. He said the man had shown him what a ceiling looks like from underneath, and that knowing where the ceiling is, precisely, is the beginning of real training rather than the continuation of confident training, and that the two are different things, and that the difference is worth whatever it costs to learn it. What he had heard in those 11 seconds, standing close enough to touch the man who had just stopped a hand 1.5 inches from his ear, was a single sentence spoken quietly enough that the front row could not make it out. The sentence was not a boast. It was not an instruction. It was offered the way a craftsman offers information about his craft to someone who has just encountered the craft for the first time at its full expression. Several people over the years asked the champion to repeat the sentence, and he declined until late in his life. And when he finally shared it, he said he had declined not because it was private, but because he had spent decades trying to understand it completely, and he had wanted to be certain he understood it before he passed it forward. The sentence was, "The distance you choose tells everything about what you believe." This is not a complicated sentence. It is, in fact, a simple sentence. But simple sentences about real things carry more weight than complicated sentences about approximate things, and the champion, standing on the canvas in the blue-white light in September of 1964, with the hand that had stopped 1.5 inches from his ear being lowered, understood that it was a sentence about far more than the 11 seconds that had just passed. It was a sentence about every decision a person makes about how close to stand to something true, and whether that decision is made from confidence or from certainty, and whether those two things are the same, and whether they need to be. He had spent 47 fights learning that confidence was something you built. He spent the rest of his life learning that certainty was something else and that you could not build it the same way. The man in the fourth row, third seat from the center aisle, whose name now occupies a different kind of space in history than it did in September of 1964, would be asked many times about that evening, and he answered consistently with a brief courtesy. He said it was a good arena and a good program. He said the demonstrations had been well organized. He did not describe what had happened in those 11 seconds in any interview with any additional detail. He was not being modest. Modesty is the management of reputation. He was simply someone for whom the thing that had happened was complete, and complete things do not require amendment. There is a particular kind of man who receives a challenge in public and responds to it with the exact amount of effort the challenge requires and no more, and who returns, when the response is complete, to what he was doing before the challenge arrived. That kind of man is not indifferent. He is not unaware of the audience or the stakes or the cost of what was just offered. He is simply someone who does not confuse the size of a moment with the importance of it. Some moments are large and unimportant. Some moments are 11 seconds long and last a lifetime. The thing a man shows about himself when he chooses how close to stand is not his confidence. It is his understanding of what is real, and the gap between those two things is the only distance that matters. Next week we are going to talk about the night Muhammad Ali walked into a closed session at a California training facility and told the man who ran it that any system that could not handle a moving target was a system built for display and not for truth, and what happened over the following 40 minutes that Ali himself never publicly described, but that 3 witnesses documented in separate written accounts that surfaced 30 years apart. Make sure you are subscribed, turn the notification on. And if you know someone who believes that reputation is the same as reality, send them this video, because what happened in Long Beach in September of 1964 is the most precise illustration of that difference that I have ever found.